Welcome to Qt Widgets and More. In today's episode, and actually the next two episodes too, I will turn my attention to delegates. You know, model view framework. I've talked a lot about models, but there is quite a bit to be said about delegates. I'll introduce you to a framework for delegates in this episode. And well, what will happen in the next two is for me to introduce by then. In the multi-threading material I've been teaching numerous times in our Qt classes, the very first slide says, maybe you don't need multi-threading. Maybe you can just do with and then go through a number of discussions on how to use the event loop. I always found that interesting and funny. So I'll start out talking about when you do not need a delegate. Up here in this user interface, you can see some very interesting UI. It is grayed out here. There's a line that is super red. I can select items, but not all items. The font changes, the alignment changes, and so on. And how did I do all of this? Well, I did it using the data method. Just move this slightly away. What you can see here in my data method, and this, by the way, is just completely made up data here, just for the example. So in my data method, if it's display role, then return €100 times the row. You can see it goes up here. If it's a background color and we are at row number 0, then it should be red. Otherwise, it should just be the default. If it's a foreground, then change that. The text alignment, change that. The font, change that. And I even also have flags set up here saying that if it's below 3, then it should be disabled. See, I cannot go further up than this one. So 0, 1, 2, these elements up here are disabled. If it's below 5, then it's editable. So this one can change. This one can change. And of course, it's, there is no set data method implemented. So even if I went up here and change it to 700, then there would be no data set. Editing delegates, I'll talk much more about them, not next time, but the time following that. But as you can see, lots of things has changed without implementing a delegate. You might have thought to yourself, but Jesper, wait a minute, can you scroll up a bit? And I could say, sure, I can do that. Well, what you really want is to move this way. And then you say, but Jesper, you are returning a money instance. And in a money instance, clearly QTableView, QListView, and QTreeView, and any other QAbstractItemView subclasses wouldn't know how to convert a money instance into the euro 700 here, for example. So you must have done something. And yes, I have done something. Let's just look at money.h. What I did was I declared my money instance with QDeclare meta type, and I implemented this toString. That's not a magic word as it would be in Python or Java or JavaScript or whatnot. No, it comes from QMeta type register converters, this one here. That's actually a templarized method that takes the from and the to, and the from is a money instance and the to is a result of toString, namely a QString. So if I ever need to go from a money instance to a string, then I can do it like this, at least with the help of the meta type system inside of Qt. And that's exactly what QTableView, or in this instance here, QListView, uses when it gets a money instance wrapped in a Q variant and it needs to display it. It'll take it and it'll say, can you please convert this Q variant into a string by calling this particular method on it? And it does. And then I have it as a string representation. And as you can see right over here, no need for a delegate. You can not always be as lucky that you do not need a delegate. Otherwise, this episode would be really odd, wouldn't it? So which delegate should you choose? There are actually 3 to choose from this. QAbstractItemDelegate, which is, as the name indicates, abstracts. Then there's QItemDelegate and QStyledItemDelegate. Now, which of those 3 should you use? Well, likely the non-abstract version. So either ItemDelegate or StyleItemDelegate. And as the text here shows, since Qt 4, there are 2 delegate classes, QItemDelegate and QStyledItemDelegate. And it continues on a bit further down saying that we therefore recommend using QStyledItemDelegate as a base class when implementing custom delegates. See, I kind of disagree with that. QItemDelegate has some nifty facilities that QStyledItemDelegate doesn't have. But let's start out with if you can spot the difference. So what you look at here is a simple model shown in 3 different views. We have a list view here, we have a table view here, and we have a tree view here. This is using QStyledItemDelegate as the delegate. This is using QStandardItemDelegate as the delegate. And this is not specifying any delegate. And I challenge you, if you can spot any difference between these 3. Yeah, you just look, pause, take whatever time. I'll bet you won't find any difference simply because there are no difference to be seen in a setup like this. So I set out on the quest of, can I possibly find a difference? And the difference, of course, comes around if your style do something in its rendering. The standard item delegate just have the rendering code hard-coded. Then they realized, well, we should let the style decide on that. And what can the style decide on? Well, it can decide on a lot of things. So I tried to find a solution for that. And I needed to go and change the Qt version, first of all, so that I could get more styles in, namely those that came with my KDE. So if you just give me a second, I'll switch over to a different style on my KDE and run this code here with my Qt installed on my KDE system. Okay, now you can clearly see the difference. I'm using the Oxygen style with the Qt compiled on my system. And why is that important? Well, because the style is a plugin on my Linux system and it needs to be exact same Qt version and everything. You can see, first of all, you can see these 2 versions here look exactly the same, which is not surprising because as the documentation says, the default style is the QStyledItemDelegate. So that's the default delegate that we're using here. They look exactly the same. You can actually see a bit of difference here. The font is slightly different from the standard item delegate and the style item. And I'll show you one more change here. If I select this item, it goes selecting the whole item, including the icon over there. If I select it over here, it only selects the text, not the full thing. But you need to be really careful. But of course, if you have a system that is heavily styled, then you will see a difference, I'm sure. Okay, so let's try and implement a delegate. Let's see what it takes to implement a subclass of QStyledItemDelegate. First of all, in my main, I set up my list view, I set up my model, and then I call on my view setItemDelegate. There is setItemRowDelegate, setItemColumnDelegate, or is it setRowItemDelegate? Well, I can't remember. There are 3 different. One for the whole view, 1 per column, 1 per row. Unfortunately, not 1 per cell, which would have been a nice addition, but that's for another day. The delegate that we implement looks like this. So it's subclassing from QStyledItemDelegate. I have this sub step up here that Clacy doesn't like, seems, or Clangtight doesn't like, which is just for me to show 2 different things. So the first one, looking at QStyledItemDelegate, there is this display text that I can overwrite. And if I look at that, what it does is that it actually returns the value. So I can, this is with display text here. It looks good. I can overwrite that. And unfortunately, it doesn't give me much because most carefully to observe is that I cannot change any of the appearance. I can only go and extract the value. And that I could already do by the toString method. Of course, there is this local over here that might give me more details on how I actually typeset. But again, I'll actually interview Pepe for an episode on how do you properly make good localization application. But that's for another day. The other step was to say, okay, let's sub step 2 here. And let's compile that. Now I'm overriding the paint method instead. And if I'm overriding the paint method, what is it you didn't like? If substep. Oh, sorry. There we are. If I'm overriding the paint step, then I have much more control. And you can see down here, what I do now is that I will go and get the amount out of my index here, just as I did up there. And then I'll draw that text to that option.rect. Option.rect, that is the rectangle that this particular index is to be painted into, and then the amount to string. And let me run that. Ooh. Yeah, that didn't look like it did before, did it? There were no change in color, no change in font size, no change in alignment. And the reason for all of that is that that's exactly what the style usually will take care of. It will listen to all of these different things from the model and render things differently. All I did was just to render the text. Had I selected an item, no highlight would have been, or selection would have been displayed. Let's try and debug our way into the style itself to see what exactly is it doing and see if that's easily replicatable. So I recompiled the application once again, this time with my own build Qt, and I changed to substep number 3, which means that I'll be just using the default painting with this QStyledItem : paint. So let's debug our way in and see what it does. I'll simply go into the paint method here, and I can see that the painting, it will start out setting up some style options here, or initializing the style option. It will then see if there's a widget associated, and you'll find a style for that thing, and then it'll call, as you clearly know if you implemented a bunch of styles yourself. You haven't? Anyway, it'll call draw control, and it's calling this with QItemView, meaning can you please, with this painter, with these options and this widget, can you please draw an item view? And let's see what that means. So draw control, I go in here, it does a lot of fetching stuff, and eventually it'll say, okay, delegate to draw control of the comment style. Fair enough. Go in here, and we're switching again, and you can see this is for the push button and for the push button bevel and for a bunch of other things, and it will go down to for the item view. And okay, cool, now we're ready. I'll save the painter, that's always a good idea. If I change the painter, I'll set the clipping rect to that rectangle that I got in there. I will find a bunch of rectangles. I will call upon a proxy style in case there's one of these. And then I'll check whether it has an indicator. Okay, obviously not. Mode for the icon, if it's enabled, whatever. Okay, so it's disabled. Cool. Okay, let me get the state here. That is whether it's on or off. And let me paint that. Okay, time to draw the text. And I will set up the color group for the palette, or I'll find the colors from the palette and so on. And if the item is selected, I'll set the pen to that. If not, send it to that. If it's in editing, then I'll do this and I'll draw the item text. And let me just scroll down a bit here. See, there's more stuff that would happen if I were to replicate a QStyled item subclass painting. I would need to do basically all of these things. It's actually worse than that. I cannot just go over and copy and paste all of that code, because that's the whole idea. It is the style that we were looking at there. If I implemented my own style, it could look entirely different. But there is a nice thing to realize in all of this. That is, if I'm talking about delegates that is painting, not the editing delegate. I'll talk about those in a few episodes. But no, the delegates where I'm painting the pixels myself. I am very likely to paint every single pixel in the cell. And then there is no need for adhering to the subclass of the delegate. Actually, if there is a style that I would like to adhere to, then I could do that. I could go and look up in the style the details that I needed. But in most cases, all I need is to be able to fetch the font, the color of the background and the foreground, and actually get a highlight painted and so on. And in those situations, there is a much easier path forward using QItemDelegate instead of QStyledItemDelegate. So let's just subclass from QItemDelegate again. You can see I'm subclassing from QItemDelegate, and I'm implementing the paint method. And let's run that. And as you can see, not very good still, or again, or however you want to put that. But if we go and look at the alternatives, that is to paint myself something that looks like this, but I'm ahead of myself how I got to that code. I got to it by looking at the documentation or the code for the style or the QItemDelegate myself, and you see there's a bunch of protected method here. There's a draw display, draw decoration, draw focus. They're all virtual protected method that I could override in my own subclasses. I would be tempting and saying, oh cool, I'll just subclass from draw display, but as you can see, it takes a QString, and taking a QString we're back to the same problem as before, that I really want the real data type, my money instance, rather than just a QString, to avoid parsing that string to get back to the real data. Okay, but it has the promise that there's all of these virtual methods. Maybe I can call these myself, and as you can see over here, I am actually calling these myself. But let's see first, what does the actual implementation of Paint look like? Well, it is not that complex anymore. It looks like this. I am getting my option out of this one. So it's basically just filling in this data structure here for the option and the set option. You can see down here it takes where it goes into the index and asks for the font. And then it set the options font to be something here. It goes in and asks for the TextAlignmentRole, set that. It goes ForegroundRole and set that, and so on. So now I have this data structure here, which has been pulling out a lot of these data from the index already. Then I am saving my painter. I'm setting up some clipping here. If we are to draw decoration, I do some stuff here. If I'm drawing checkboxes, I do some stuff there. I fetch the text and so on. And at the end of it, draw background, draw check, draw decoration, draw display, and draw focus. And draw focus is the thing that gets me the focus or the current item visible whenever I have one of these. And then restore again. And just more or less cut and pasting these virtual methods here into my own delegate. I am pretty far, and then just run it so you can see it. Now it looks exactly like before. What do I have now? I'm saving my painter. I'm calling this set option method to get the option. Draw the background. I don't need to worry about fetching the background color or whether I am alternate background on my view. All of that stuff, it will get into my opt here, and to draw background. Draw display. That's the line that I likely want to do something about. What I do here is simply just take the amount out of my money instance here in toString. But it might have been that I wanted to draw the euro sign in a different color, or do something where I did draw the text in one color, the euro sign in another, or the euro sign extra large, or depending on something either at the right side or the left side. All of these things I could have done in this draw, in place of this draw display. Draw the focus, restore my painter. And actually, this is very much a pattern for any delegate that you want to do. It only works because I'm painting all the pixels. But again, I do that in all the delegates that I have myself, at least. Okay, I know you want to see a real example of this applied. Well, how about this example that we paint everything as usual, but if the amount is negative, then we paint it in red. I like Excel, so I would like that feature. And here is the implementation of my money delegate. It's subclassing, go away. It's subclassing from ItemDelegate, just the default constructor of the ItemDelegate reused, and I implement the paint. And all I need to do in here, I get my amount. I save my painter because I'm changing stuff to my painter, so by all means save it, because the painter will be reused for the next cell and the next cell and the next cell. So if I don't save it, I will not get the result I expected, I'm sure. Then I go and call the setIndex. I draw the background. I set the font and I check if the amount is less than 0. If that's the case, then I'll set the pen to be red. And now I'll just call upon the draw text method of my painter with the rectangle here, the display alignment, which I got from the option, and the amount as a string. And I'll draw the focus. And let's just see it working here. You can see there's my focus. It's working nicely. The background color that came from the model, I'm purposefully ignoring that now and simply painting it in either black or in red, depending on the color, the amount is negative or not. But looking at this code here, it is really just cut and paste that, adapt it to any situation where you have. The thing to realize in here is, again, I'm drawing all the pixels. And I've said it many times already, it's almost just cut and paste this code. So why don't we make it into a base class for our future delegates like this? So we now here have a Q, which is a more delegate subclass of QItemDelegate. It's overwriting the paint method, and it has a new pure virtual method called paintInternal that is the draw text method from before, except that it actually takes an index rather than the string to paint. So I have to extract things myself there, but that gives me also the full power of actually getting to my money instance rather than getting to a string representation. And if you look at what it looks like over here, oh, this is almost cut and paste from the previous example. I save my painter, I set the index, I draw the background, I save once more here, set the pen, set the font, paintInternal, restore, and draw focus. And the reason why I need to save and restore here is that it might even change something that I didn't want in the draw focus down here, and I restore again. Now, with this framework in place, my delegate for money now looks as simple as this. I go and get the amount out of it as before. If the amount is less than 0, I set the pen to be red, and now painter draw text, and that's the drawing. And if we go back over here, everything being exactly the same, it's just this line here that now calls upon my subclass. If I want more modifications, well, I could do more modifications down in this setup, but all the defaults, the background color, the font, all of those things has already been set by the framework, and I just need to implement these few lines. Congratulations, you made it through the first of 3 episodes on delegates. In the next episode, I'll show you 3 slightly more advanced delegates that is building on this framework, and which is just to more or less cut and paste, or at least be inspired from implementing your own delegates. And in the episode following that, I will turn to editing delegates. That's delegate with a custom editor. So far, we only seen delegates that paint stuff, but you can also have editors in your delegate, and we'll turn to those in the episode following the next. Until then, have a great time. I'm Jesper Petersen from QTab, and if you ever need any help, do reach out to us, will you?